Hey guys, welcome back to Sister, a podcast for spiritual baddie. We are your hosts, Elle and Amaya, and today we will be talking about Baneful Magic and the do's and don'ts.
Hello, everyone. This is a subject I feel very strongly about.
Honestly, we both do.
Painful magic is something that we kind of touched upon whenever we talked about discrimination and also Wicca last season. So I figured it'd be a good idea for us to kind of dive into what it truly is and the do's and don'ts, just so that you kind of have an idea of if you are wanting to practice baneful magic, what you should be doing. I want to preface this by I am a chaos practitioner, so baneful magic is right up my alley. So I don't think that there is anything wrong with it, but I do, however, think it has a time and a place.
Right, just don't do it just because you're bored and have nothing better to do with your life. Also, as always, make sure you check out our links in our description so you can learn a little bit more. As you know, we are journalists in our own right, and always make sure to do our research prior to doing our episodes so we're not just spewing nonsense. So let's just keep that in mind when we talk about Baneful Magic.
I will also be adding some book recommendations that Amaya will put in the description on YouTube, and I will put in our description for the podcast version on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, that sort of thing. So there will also be some resources that I've personally read and think are really great and can recommend to you. So what is baneful magic, Amaya?
Yes, so baneful magic is any spell or ritual that is meant to cause harm. But what does it mean to cause harm, and how can you understand it to be anything creating injury, hurt, suffering, distress, or even mental, physical, or spiritual distress?
Yeah, so basically, baneful magic is meant to cause some sort of distress to someone. We are also going to talk a little bit about binding and the implications of that as well, whether it is binding for baneful purposes or in love magic, because some people see the love magic of binding also considered baneful magic, but we will talk about that. So, the main types of baneful magic, the first one and the most common one that you're going to hear about all over the internet is hexes. Even the big companies like Walmart are jumping on that train. Last year, I got a crew neck from Walmart that said hexes to my exes on it. So,
It's
it's
crazy.
definitely something that is becoming more and more common terminology, but there is a difference between like a hex, a curse, and a jinx. So let's talk about hexes. Hexes are much stronger than jinxes. These are spells that will send negative energy towards your target, depending on your intention, but the hex won't last a super long time. So generally, a hex is either like seasonal or set for a duration of time, or will stop working when the target has learned their lesson. Hexes are often useful when someone continues to do wrong over and over again and you want or need them to change.
Curses. So, unlike hexes or jinxes, curses are meant to last for a long time. Some curses can even last for generations. A curse can be placed on a person, family, place, or something else, and curses are really the worst of the worst and should be saved for dire situations. It's typical for witches to cast curses on their abusers or on someone who made their life a living hell.
Then jinxes are small, relatively harmless spells. When you cast a jinx, it will cause your target a minor inconvenience that is temporary. Casting a jinx mainly makes you feel better about a situation. The downside is that you probably won't know if it worked unless you are super close with the individual. Jinxes are generally harmless towards the target, but are mean-spirited. They're cast when you want something negative to happen to your target. They also don't last that long, although you can set a specific time period before casting a jinx. So this is things like, oh, I wish you'd go step on a Lego. Like
Or wishing that you'll never get the cold side of the pillow no matter what. I say that one a lot to my enemies. I'm not going to lie to you. It's very inconvenient. Binding. So, binding is the equivalent act of a restraining order on someone who is entering the scary realm of troublesome or has the potential to or has been actively causing emotional, spiritual, or physical harm. Remember that word. Other forms of binding that may be considered baneful because of taking away someone's free will are often seen in love magic. This is a very big one that we touched on last season, where people sometimes do spells on others to kind of make them fall in love with them when, like, A, you don't either know them or they're not doing enough for you. But you need to remember people have free will, and the spell, curse, whatever you want to call it, it's not going to last. So I would recommend that you really think about putting a binding spell or curse on someone before you do it, because remember, especially with love spells, you're going to have to keep doing it to make it work.
Then we have banishing, which is the equivalent of either like a relocation program or a jail sentence in like spiritual terms, depending on the intention. So the subject of the banishment is being sent away or contained in some way for the protection of either yourself or others around you. And once you take action by casting a banishment, the individual becomes your spiritual kind of responsibility. In other words, you have to continue maintaining wards and things like that to keep them away from you even after you have banished them. So that's why like you see the banishing freezer spells like on TikTok and stuff. And yeah, that's great if you do it, but if you don't continuously keep wards up and protections, then that banishing freezer spell isn't going to do a whole lot for you because they're eventually going to break free from that and then you're going to have to keep doing it. So once again, banishing can be a good thing if you are someone who keeps strong wards and protections up around you all the time, which you should be doing anyways if you're casting Baneful Magick, but that's more in the do's and don'ts. So let's go on to some discourse you may hear regarding Baneful Magick.
When the subject of baneful magic comes up, common declarations range from "no one should ever hex or curse" to "it's too dangerous to hex or curse until you have been practicing for X number of years" to "a witch who cannot hex cannot heal" to "witches who do not hex are not real witches." So these declarations make sweeping assumptions about other people's paths and rely upon universalized views of how magic works. Also, in being grossly oversimplified, they somehow simultaneously center and dismiss complex issues of ethics and morality. In these forms, they also manage to traipse into unnecessary gatekeeping and path shaming. Yes, all of them, even a witch who cannot hex, cannot heal.
And that is from Sydney Eileen, who is a very experienced practitioner, which will have her ethical things talked about more. Ethics of Baneful Magick. So once again, we're here talking about the threefold law. So in case you didn't listen to our episode on Wicca, this law is used by those who are Wiccan to claim any energy you put out into the universe, whether thoughts, rituals, spells, incantations, etc., will come back to you in 3 times the strength. It's important to bring this up again because within the witchcraft space, this law is referred to by many as to why you shouldn't practice baneful magic. However, there are so many types of witchcraft where this law doesn't apply at all. This goes once again into the discourse that everyone's practice is their own, and we don't all abide by the same ideologies, the same way Christians and Jewish people don't follow the same ideologies. Wicca also often uses the ideas of calling baneful magic black magic, which, as we talked about last season in our discrimination video and our Wicca video, is inherently racist. Well, I guess episode, not video. You could be watching it in a video. And go back to those 2 episodes if you want to hear more on that. Overall, the threefold law is more so meant to create a sense of paranoia around baneful magic and doesn't have much of a leg to stand on when evaluating baneful magic from other traditions and cultures, which were appropriated to create Wicca. So they kind of cut out all of the things that they didn't think were love and light enough and said, you can't do that. Threefold law.
Morality is going to differ from person to person. So when you're faced with moral questions like the trolley scenario, if you aren't familiar, this scenario states that there are 2 sets of tracks, one with someone close to you on it and one with 7 strangers on it. You have to decide which track the trolley would go on, resulting in the people no longer living. It's a moral dilemma, and every person is going to evaluate it differently. The same goes for morality when it comes to witchcraft and baneful magic. Some may see a spell to get a job as baneful magic because you inadvertently are harming the other candidates who apply because you are ensuring your success in an interview. Everyone evaluates situations differently when it comes to any type of spell. Morality and the idea of what is baneful is a relative idea based on each individual. I have a lot of experience with this in my own way because my mom is always like, you should do this to get this job and secure it. And I'm more kind of the person that's like, if it's meant to be, it will be on my path. And sometimes you have to learn patience because if you really want something, it'll be meant for you, or it will not be meant for you because there's always something better. So just because you might be practicing something or putting a spell to make sure you're more appealing in your job interview per se, that doesn't necessarily harm the other candidates. However, you may think that you have a leg up compared to others because of your spell.
Yeah,
Just
and that
something to keep in mind.
also goes to, the fact that like morally everything is different for every individual person. I personally don't see a problem with doing a money bowl ever. Like I think that that's a great thing. I have one that I do every new moon, but some people may be uncomfortable with that idea because they're like, "Oh, well, by you doing that, you're like forcing people to spend money at your store basically." And like I also believe and we have free will. I don't think that that's altering people's brain chemistry. I'm not targeting it at anyone. I don't think it's doing any harm. I think it's just a way
Right.
to get people who are already going to be coming to my store to spend some money when they come in. But it all depends from person to person as what they view as acceptable and moral. And, it's very interesting to think about what baneful magic is in different people's mindsets.
Right. And it's one thing to do something to enhance your experience, like Elle said, a money bowl, versus specifically placing something on someone, something, or a place that could potentially end up being harmful.
Yeah. So there is also intended and unintended consequences that we should speak about. So something else that kind of needs to be taken into account is the possible outcomes of baneful magic. You will often hear on TikTok about a hex backfiring because the person it was done on has protections up. They may have ancestors that protect them. They may also do protective workings to keep themselves protective. This is something that has to be taken into consideration when doing baneful magic, and you should always take in possible repercussions and have workarounds in your spell work to either undo the spell if it backfires or to make sure that the energy doesn't boomerang back to you if it backfires. Because if you're putting that energy out there, energy is a flow. And if it's going towards someone and they have all these words and protections up and it bounces off of them, it's coming back to the sender 9 times out of 10. That's why you hear about hexes backfiring on people. It's not that they performed the working incorrectly, it's that the person they performed it on had protections up and it boomeranged back. So you can make work-ins with your hexes of ways to undo them. You also should always be writing down your spells, whether it is baneful magic or any other kind of magic. That way, you know what went into it, so you can undo and reverse the effects of it if something were to backfire on you. Most times that's not going to happen, but it could happen, and that's something you need to take into account and prepare yourself for.
So now we're going to talk about the do's and don'ts of baneful magic. So starting with the do's, always do your research. We can't stress it enough. If you don't do research, then why do something? And this goes without saying, any type of magic should be well researched before starting a ritual. Many spell ingredients also have baneful properties that you should look into and make sure you know exactly what each item is intended in order to do your spell.
Yeah, that's a really important one because especially with crystals that you may incorporate in baneful magic, like everything, whether it's an herb or crystal for the most part, has your normal metaphysical properties, and then there's usually baneful properties that if you dig deep enough in your research, you can find out what they are. And a lot of times with crystals specifically, it's the opposite of what it normally does. So you need to make sure that your ingredients are charged with that intention, or it's not going to have the intended effect. That's why doing your research is so important when it comes to baneful magic specifically. The next one is sourcing items consciously. We talked about this last season, but this especially goes for Baneful Magic. There are a number of items used in Baneful Magic that you should be super conscious about sourcing. One of the big ones that you'll see on social media is graveyard or cemetery dirt. There is a very specific way to collect graveyard or cemetery dirt, and there is a very specific way to thank the people from that graveyard or cemetery that you are taking the dirt from, leaving offerings. So be sure to do your research on how to obtain the materials that you need for your baneful working. I just use the graveyard dirt as an example because it is one I see all the time being talked about, and no one talking about how to appropriately procure that item. I also wouldn't recommend going on like Etsy and buying like graveyard dirt because you don't know what intentions were set with it, what the person did to get it, if it was actually sourced consciously, things like that.
You should also wait and plan, so be sure before doing a baneful working that you take some time to wait and think about what it's gonna do. Why are you gonna do it? And are there any possible repercussions if the spell backfires? These are all questions that should be thought about, and make sure that the situation that made you want to do the baneful working isn't just going to blow over, leaving you with regret of doing the working. This is a big one. And I say this because sometimes when a situation is not going in your favor, maybe something is happening in a way you don't like, or you're being harmed, or whatever the case is, I think when you do baneful magic, you should be not only ensuring that what you're doing is going to help you, but also you're not just doing it willy nilly.
Yeah, and this more so goes for things along the lines of like banishing, bindings, hexes, and curses. Jinxes, as we said, have a lot shorter of a lifespan and a lot of times can be done just by speaking it into existence. So that's not necessarily like, obviously, like you don't want to do something that's going to have long-term effects on someone if you aren't sure that that's 100% what you want to do. The next thing we're going to talk about is making sure you're protected. So when performing baneful magic, you should make sure you are well protected first. This is why every witch on the internet will tell you you need to learn protection magic first. You just do. And this can look a number of ways, like wearing protective crystals, having a protective talisman, having multiple layers of warding and protection done on yourself, your home, your car. Maybe you even put protections on like your phone for your social media so it doesn't get hacked and things like that. There should be multiple layers of protection. And these are things that can be done simply. Like one of the things I did when I was building the shop is under all of the walls before I painted pentacles so that the shop always has that layer of protection under the paint. You know, that's one thing that you should think about is always having extra layers of protection because one, other people's baneful magic isn't going to hit you. And two, it's going to keep you protected if it hits someone who has a lot of protections and it comes curdling back at you.
Last but not least, you should get creative with spell ingredients. For baneful magic, you often see the same things like cemetery dirt, rusty nails, poppy seeds, and so on for your workings. However, you can easily use these things you find in your house: hot sauce or hot pepper spices, animal droppings, rotting vegetables, or fruit. There's so many different ways to do a baneful working, you just have to think outside the box. And I agree with this. Sometimes you might need more than just a rusty nail or cemetery dirt. Think of the things that you can use in your house. You might, if you have a pet, you might want to use their, what they
Droppings,
do.
excrements.
Yeah, their droppings after, they go to the bathroom to protect yourself. Or you can do things, use different spices for different things. A lot of the time, something I do when I cleanse myself and want to protect myself from others' energy with an egg cleansing, on top of it, I do hot red pepper over the egg and the water to kind of send that energy back to sender.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that you can incorporate even slightly baneful things, like in a return to sender that Amaya just talked about. That doesn't have to be like some big ritual that like you're thinking about and specifically doing on like one specific person, because sometimes you do a cleansing ritual and you don't know where that energy is coming from. So you throw a little hot sauce or red pepper on there and send it back to them. Another thing, if on the animal droppings route, if you're wanting to bind someone to having a crappy life because they really wronged you, that is a great tool to use to bind them to. Just putting that out there.
And if you want to take it a step further, you can also use your own if you're into that kind of thing. Just saying. So,
Some
yeah.
don'ts now. Don't use baneful magic on someone you live with. This is a hill I will die on. When you live with someone and perform a hex or a curse on them, there's a good chance because you are in close contact that that energy will impact you and everyone in your home, not just your target. It's better to not do baneful workings on those that you live with, maybe opt for a return to sender instead, because that means any negative energy that they're sending to you will go back to them rather than putting out the energy and it's going to hit them. But because you live with them, the repercussions could hit everyone in your house, regardless of the protections that you have up.
Next, do a binding ritual unless you're 100% sure. Binding rituals may not be considered painful to all going back to the moral relevance. However, many people do view binding as baneful magic and because it takes away free will. Don't bind yourself to someone unless you're 100% sure that is what you and the other person want. Bindings can be hard to break, and while many things seem great now, it may be a nightmare in the long run if you decide you no longer want that person and they continue to be obsessed with you. We talked about this a lot in season 2. Oh my god, this is a hill that I will die on. I think it's important to know that you have free will as a person, so does the person that you so desire. So when you're doing rituals and spells and all kinds of things to kind of get them to be with you forever, you don't know what that comes with. They might be obsessed with you, but for the wrong reasons. You know, they could potentially harm you because they desire you so much, and they might do things that you may not desire. So when you're binding yourself to someone for the rest of your life, do you really want like everything that they come with? Like you need to know and be sure before you do all that that they're what you want and vice versa.
And obviously, there also is like baneful binding, which I just talked about with the animal droppings, and that's like different. But as far as like binding someone for romantic reasons goes, like there are binding rituals that are standard in pagan practices. Like whenever you get married, it is very common to have a hand fasting ritual, which is considered a form of binding. But if you're going into marriage, I hope you are sure about that person. Like, if you are
Yeah.
going to the trouble to find a pagan officiant to hand fast you, which is what I want in the future, um, you better be sure about that person. Like, you don't want to just go and bind yourself to your boyfriend that you've been dating for 3 weeks because you don't know what that person is truly like in 6 months, a year, two
Right.
years. It should be something that is taken very seriously because it can cause that serious obsession that they will never leave you alone. You can do cord cuttings, but if you don't do the cord cutting right, they're still going to be obsessed with you. And sometimes you don't even do a binding ritual and people are still obsessed with you.
Exactly. We both have experience with that. So, yeah, I think that if you're really gonna do a binding ritual, you need to be sure that this is your person. You need to know like every single bad habit that they do, and if they're willing to change said bad habits, what their downfalls might be, like every single thing about them. And this is why many people end up breaking up with their partners for long term, because they realize it's not what they wanted, and they haven't even moved in with that person to really know what they're truly like. And that's why my mom always tells me, move in with your partner before you get married so you know what they are like, so
Yep.
you know. But yeah,
That's my
anyway.
family's. So next, don't culturally appropriate, which once again, we're back on this hill and we are dying on it. So there are certain rituals that are baneful that are specifically for closed practices. I talked earlier episode, I think it was last episode, about poppets, briefly. There are versions of poppets that are specific to certain closed practices. Voodoo dolls specific to voodoo. There are other versions of poppets that come from different folk magic traditions in English Celtic folk magic. But make sure that if you are going to be doing a ritual, that you are researching it, as we said earlier, and you aren't infringing on a closed practice. Because if you are doing a baneful ritual that is stealing someone else's culture, I guarantee you it is going to backfire on you big time. This goes back to the same conversation we had last season of do not upset other people's ancestors.
Yeah, pretty much. Next, don't cast a spell that you're not sure about. When casting Baneful Magic, it's important to remember to use your intuition and discernment, and if you think twice about casting the spell and whether or not the person deserves it, you probably should wait to cast the spell. That one is kind of self-explanatory, so just
Yeah,
really,
definitely think about it. Just think about it.
yeah. If you think twice, maybe it's not a good idea.
And our last don't is the overuse of Baneful Magic. Baneful Magic is a great tool to hold people accountable that have caused serious harm. However, you often see people on social media, once again, TikTok, casting out of small spiteful situations like someone cutting them off in traffic. Know the time and place for Baneful Magic, and once again, use your intuition and discernment before casting. There's a big difference between hexing an abuser versus the lady who hit you with a shopping cart on accident in the grocery store. If it is something that is not going to matter in 5 hours or another day or two, then you probably shouldn't be using Baneful Magic for it. And once again, this isn't specifically about jinxes because we talked about jinxes and how they are very short lasting, and a lot of times you say things and it just can be considered a jinx. But this is for like actual ritual castings of hexes or curses, where you should be taking into consideration of who you are casting it on, if they truly deserve it. I am all for you casting a curse or a hex on your abuser. Go ahead, do that every single time. I am all for you casting a hex or a curse to hold people in power accountable. Like if you got screwed over from someone in power, even if it's like a job that you got fired from because someone wasn't doing their due diligence, and you want to have a hex to make them be held accountable for them to learn, then do that. But it's definitely is a thing where you have to use your discernment and your intuition, and don't just anytime you get mad, go ahead and throw a hex at someone. Like that's going to be counterproductive. It takes a lot of time and energy, and it's not worth it.
Let's get right into our astrology almanac with Elle.
Today, the moon in Taurus will sextile with Saturn in Pisces, making it easier to get things done. Then on the 22nd, the sun will enter Scorpio. This will be a serious time for work and transformation. Hello, Scorpio season. Take in the passionate and strong energy and get things done. Lastly, on the 24th, we have a last quarter moon in Leo. This is a time to clear out the old and let go of the emotional baggage. Not a ton happening this week in astrology, but enough.
Last but not least, let's get right into tarot time.
So we have the 10 of Pentacles. This is the fruits of your labor coming to fruition. This is making that money, getting that bag, it all finally rounding out and coming to you. This is a very fruitful time for you and a successful time for you. I think that, the astrology for this week of telling you to focus on your passions and the things that, make you happy and being very good in your workflow, very representative of this.
Beautiful message for this week. And as always, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Sister, a podcast for spiritual baddies. Make sure you follow us on TikTok and Instagram, and be sure to subscribe to us on our YouTube channel, and maybe follow us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts so you know when the next episode drops. Until next time, see you then.
Bye, guys.